First, I have a very important question for all of you. Do you know why Fridays exist? Fridays exist for one very particular reason. It is for you to deploy something to production, to go home, turn off your phone notifications, and then everything breaks and everything's bad. And if you don't have notifications, you're happy. Not happy on Monday. But that's why Fridays exist. So I'm pretty sure this has happened to each one of you, and there's a lot of panic in those situations. And the next topic is how not to panic when something like this happens. And coming all the way from London, Euan Finlay, who is a senior integration engineer at Financial Times, the Financial Times office at London, he's going to talk about how not to panic in such situations. So please give him a very warm welcome and a big round of applause.
Cheers. Thank you very much. Hello, hello, hello. Is this on? Is this working? Let's double check. Hello, hello, hello. Can you hear me? Is that all okay? All good? Good with the sound? So brilliant. So hi, thank you very much for the introduction. I really appreciate it. So my name's Euan, and I'm here to talk about support and production incidents. So as Rado mentioned, I'm a senior integration engineer at the Financial Times, and I originally started off in desktop support. I did some time as a Linux sysadmin, and I'm now working more in the sort of DevOps space. Currently, I lead a team at the Financial Times who support and maintain our back-end content APIs. We work a lot with Kubernetes and Docker and Go microservices. And although we're most famous for the newspaper, we're actually primarily a digital content company. Last year was the first time that revenue from our digital content overtook the physical paper and our advertising as well. And this means that our content and our website are absolutely critical to our survival. We invest really heavily into technology, and we've got many teams working on different areas across the business. We're actually in the process of transferring ownership of some of our core platforms, systems, and APIs to our new office in Sofia. And at the FT, we're really big believers in DevOps practices and empowered engineering teams, trusting them to make the best decisions around technology, architecture, and delivery. So as part of that, our teams fully own, run, and support their services from the very beginning to the end of the product lifecycle. So maybe you're part of a team that's been running for a while, and you're proud of the services that your team have built and deployed, but it's still quite intimidating being told that you're now responsible for dealing with production issues. Or maybe you're a new developer or engineer that's just started in technology recently. You've had time to settle in and grow and started to get familiar with things, but now you're being asked to go on the support rota. So, quick straw poll. Hands up if you've been on call. And hands up if you've never had to deal with production support at all. And hands up if you don't like putting up your hands in the middle of conference talks, because I definitely don't. So I still remember what it felt like the first time that I was called out. It was terrifying. I was asked to fix a service that I knew nothing about. I couldn't find the documentation. I thought it was honestly the worst thing in the world, and I actually thought about quitting technology entirely and becoming a llama farmer. So I feel it's something like imposter syndrome. No matter how good you are, I think everyone feels something similar the first time that they get called out or start handling production incidents. And even now, with experience, I still get an absolute twinge of fear whenever my phone goes off in the middle of the night, or if someone reports the website is down. What if it's something that I can't fix? Or what if I'm not good enough? So how do you get to the... Oh, I think I've skipped a slide. No, I haven't. Good. So how do you get to the point where you're comfortable on call? The idea behind this talk was thinking about tips and advice and some suggestions that maybe I could give so that people aren't dreading that phone call or that Slack message of, Everything is broken. And when I was writing this talk, I was told that it helps to have a bit of a theme running throughout. So I thought, who else is quite grumpy, like a lot of sysadmins are? And who else gets woken up at 2 o'clock in the morning? And the answer was Scrooge from A Christmas Carol, which actually leads really nicely into a talk structure about how to deal with production problems. Because like A Christmas Carol, there are some things that we can do right now to help us the next time that we get called out or have serious problems. There are things that we should do when something actually breaks. And then there's things that we should do afterwards, after an incident, to improve everything for the next time it happens. So, knowing that things will go wrong at some point, what can we do to plan ahead? Handling incidents is the same as any other skill. It can be learned, it can be taught, and it can be practiced. If the first time that you try to do this is without any training, with no plan of action, after a phone call at 2 a.m., it's not going to go very well. If you're familiar with dealing with your alerts and what can go wrong with your systems, you're going to be a lot more relaxed when you get called out. So get people on your teams to rotate through support regularly, in hours when everyone on the team is available to help and support them. It will get everyone familiar with what can go wrong, the alerts that can go off, the monitoring tools that you have, where to find things like documentation or admin panels. Does everyone have access to those? You never want that moment of, I can't access the documentation during the middle of an incident. And alert noise is really bad as well. Every alert that you have, every alert that you configure should be actionable. Otherwise, you might lose real issues in the noise. Or, on the other side of things, you might get called out for no reason, which is just as bad. My ex-boss, Sarah Wells, has done an excellent talk on alert overload, and I definitely recommend watching that. And depending where you work or what services you work on, having an incident response plan might look very different. Maybe your company is large enough to have a first-line support team that escalates problems to you that they're unable to fix themselves. Your response plan might be very formal and well-defined across the whole business. Or alternatively, if you're in a small startup, it might just be a handful of you and your team getting called out by PagerDuty or an automated equivalent. In that case, you might just need a quick verbal discussion with your team or some guidelines jotted down in a Google document somewhere. Either way, get something written up because you don't want to be wondering what you're meant to be doing when the alerts go off. And on that note as well, make sure you keep your documentation up to date. Nobody likes writing documentation, at least I don't. But you need to have information on what to do when your services break. What it does, where it lives, and how it works is a really good start. And having service panic guides or runbooks are important as well. These should contain solutions for common problems that might occur with your services. Write them as though it's 2 a.m. and you've just been woken up. So only have the essentials that you need to get things fixed and up and running again. It's awful trying to fix a system that has no documentation and the only person who knows about it has left 2 months ago, which happens all the time. And once you do have these guides on how to, say, fail over or rotate keys or rebuild your infrastructure from scratch, make sure that you run through them on a regular basis so that they still work and that people are familiar with the steps in the process. We at the FT did this in fairly spectacular fashion one day when we performed what we call a unscheduled test of our disaster recovery procedures. We were provisioning a new production cluster using Ansible, and we ran our playbook, which creates us 5 new instances. Except it turns out that if you're not careful with writing your Ansible playbooks and you say, give me 5 instances, Ansible will make sure that you have 5 instances across your entire production AWS account and tear down all your previous boxes. So the first that we knew of this was when all of our alerting went off, and I hear a very quiet, oh no, from my friend who was sat next to me at the time. Was it a problem? Yes, absolutely. But we had a brief outage while we worked out what was going on, but we were back up and running fairly quickly. We failed over to our backup cluster, which could serve traffic, and as we already had a guide on how to spin all of our infrastructure back up from scratch, it wasn't too long before we were back to normal. We definitely wouldn't have wanted to find out that our disaster recovery guide didn't work at that point in time. And as an extension of that, actively break things. Check that your services behave in the way that you expect. Do your recovery guides still work? Do your alerts and monitoring work correctly? Chaos Monkey is probably a very famous example of this, but you can do this manually in a very controlled fashion as well. Run disaster recovery tests to make sure that you iron out any bugs with your processes. So we ran a planned disaster recovery test. We disconnected the network to one of our data centers to make sure that we could recover if this happened in a real-life situation. We pulled the plug, and our operations dashboard lit up with red lights, which was great. That's just what we expected. So we moved to step 2, which was fail over all of our systems to the healthy data center. It was at that point that we found that our failover system doesn't work if one of the data centers is missing. So not ideal for when you're trying to fail over. We fixed that up fairly quickly. But the last time that we actually ran one of those tests was maybe about 3 years ago, maybe about then. So for some context, we've been moving away from our physical hosted data centers for some time now as part of a big cost reduction and simplification push. We've migrated a lot of our legacy services to the cloud, replaced them with externally hosted solutions, or decommissioned them entirely if they're not needed anymore. However, there's still a number of important legacy services that run out of our 2 data centers. So you might be able to guess what the next slide will be, because we had a live test of exactly what happens when one of our data centers drop off the network. And naturally, it happened on a weekend in the middle of August when lots of people were on holiday without access to their laptops or internet. And as I'm sure you can imagine, after 2 years since the last time we ran one of these tests, a lot of the information that we had was horrendously out of date. It also turned out that there was a lot more important services depending on those data centers than we expected. So one of the useful things that we have at the FT is a chat channel that everyone can join. We use this channel to communicate changes that are in progress, to report issues or problems that people are seeing or happening. And as you can imagine, this channel got very busy during the outage with lots of reports and issues coming in from across the business. Failover of these legacy systems isn't simple or automated either. It's a fiddly manual process involving DNS changes, configuration changes, and service restarts. Since it had been so long since we'd last done any of this, we had to hope that the people with knowledge were available and that they could even remember what the steps were to do this. We did get everything stabilized without any major customer impact, so there is that. And later we found out that the cause of the problems was another customer in the data center decommissioning some of their network equipment, and in the process of doing that, they cut through our fiber connection that provided internet access to all of our servers. And there's no way that we could have predicted that happening, for example. It took us roughly 5 days for network connectivity to be fully restored, and for all of our services to be back to high availability and running out of both data centers again. Which was really fortunate, because a day later than that, we had a network switch fail in the other data center. So we repeated the same process back in the other direction. And I have no idea what we would have done if both of those problems had happened at the same time. I would have probably cried, I think. So we should have followed our own advice, basically. If we had practiced and tested this more, we would have been a lot quicker. It would have been a lot smoother, and we'd have had a much better understanding of the impact and what needed to happen to fix it. But we still did recover everything without any major business or customer impact, and we learned a lot about the remaining legacy services that are important to us. We also uncovered a whole set of issues that we had no idea about, such as a high availability service that actually couldn't talk to one of the data centers. One of our monitoring tools doesn't like it if it can't connect to all the services it's trying to monitor. And some of our legacy services run out of memory when traffic is routed to a single DC. All of those are now fixed, or in the process of being fixed. And most importantly, we've learned from our experience here, and we've used it to improve our failover documentation and our processes around this. So those are hopefully some ideas that you can go away, think about, and get started on before something goes wrong. But something's happened. Your alerts are going off, and you've been called or asked to investigate. What's the first steps that you should take? Take a deep breath, because dealing with incidents is stressful. Do what you can to remind yourself that it's not the end of the world. For most of us, if our website goes down or a service fails, it's not completely catastrophic in the grand scheme of things, unless maybe you work at a nuclear power plant, in which case maybe be a bit more worried, perhaps. But it's always tempting to immediately jump in and start trying to solve the problem. Go back to basics first. Treat it the same as anything else that you do. Get as much information as possible before you start trying to fix things. Generally speaking, no matter what the problem is, there's always a certain set of questions that I will always ask myself before digging into a problem later. What's the actual impact of this? So, for example, my team at the FT, we're a content company, and our most critical considerations are, can the journalists publish articles? And can customers access the website? A problem preventing the news from going out is a huge issue for us, and we'll immediately get multiple people or even teams investigating as soon as possible. However, if it's our Jenkins box that sends me alert that it's running low on disk space on a weekend, I probably don't really care about that, and I'll fix that on Monday. So some things to consider with this is it affecting your customers? Is the issue blocking other teams right now? And is there a brand impact? Does it make your company look bad? If it's overnight and it doesn't need to be fixed immediately, perhaps it's actually safer to wait until morning when you have a clearer head and more eyes from your team on the fix. Let's assume that it's an important system and that it does need investigating. So what's already been tried? Maybe nothing if you are the first responder. Maybe first line, if you have a first line team, have already run through the obvious solutions, restarting, failing over, for example. Or maybe your teammates have tried some fixes. Get as much information as possible, because getting vague details can sometimes hide the actual problem. I've restarted it. What's it? Is it the service, their laptop? Have they restarted the whole internet? I hope not, because that would be bad. And validate that the problem does in fact exist, because there are times when you'll have a report such as, the website is slow, which could mean anything from my home Wi-Fi router is broken, to there's load on the database, to there's been another denial of service attack on Dyn, and 90% of the internet is not working for anyone. Or maybe the monitoring system is actually broken, and it started sending out alerts to everyone. That's happened to us before. So get as much information as you can, and it's worth spending a couple of minutes at the start just to validate that there is actually a problem before you start jumping into trying to fix things. So let's assume there is a problem. What's the least effort that you can do to work around or bypass the problem and get back online? Depending on what your service is, this is often more important than actually fixing the root cause. For example, can we just fail over? Can we just roll back a release? Can we just restore a snapshot? But if you can't do that, or if you don't have a simple way to restore service, you will need to investigate. And this will depend entirely on your system architecture and your issue. I'm not going to give you technical tips, because you know your systems better than I do. Good starting points, for example, might be check the logs, check the disk, memory, CPU, network traffic. Have you checked the steps in your panic guide? Has there been a new release or deployment? Was there planned work around when the problem started? And are there other known issues or outages happening? For example, when the Dyn attack broke the internet back in 2016, or when we've had issues with AWS in the past, where S3 or EC2 have gone down for a whole region, taking out huge swathes of production infrastructure across the world. Let's assume that whatever's gone wrong isn't simple to solve. And you've done your investigation, you've tried the obvious solutions, you're still stuck, and everything is still on fire. That's okay, it happens. Call for backup if you can. Because it's often better to bring other people in early and get help quickly. You can't always fix everything on your own, and that's fine. Do your basic investigation first, of course, and confirm it's not a simple problem. But don't be afraid to call for help and get assistance if you need it. Nobody will think any less of you for doing that. And in one of the first companies that I worked at, we had an air conditioning alert for the office server room, which went off at the weekend. Our technical director got an alert from one of our monitoring systems, and he popped into the office to fix it, because he lived nearby. However, he couldn't remember the security code to get in through the door. So at this point, most people would have called us to get the new code, for example. Instead, he decided to crawl through the false ceiling of the office in order to get into the server room. And in case you're not aware, office ceilings aren't designed to support the weight of a person. So it gave way. He fell into the server room, which then caused us even more problems than the air conditioning unit, which we then had to sort out on Monday. Because it turns out that wild servers are easily startled. They don't like having people fall on top of them unexpectedly. And they definitely don't like breathing in many years of accumulated ceiling dust. It didn't look like this. In his defense, the reasoning behind it was he didn't want to disturb us on a weekend, and I can respect that. But I think overall it would have been much better for everyone if he had just called us up, asked for help, and we could have fixed the problem together without needing to replace the ceiling afterwards. So communication is really important because it's horrendously irritating if you're trying to use a service or a product, it's not working, and you've no idea if it's being investigated or if the teams or people are even aware of the issue at all. So in an instant, even though everything might be on fire, you still need to communicate with your customers and the business. And this is quite difficult when you're the person who's actually trying to fix the problem at the same time. So make someone the incident manager. They need to be in charge of handling communication. It's extremely hard to multitask in your normal day-to-day work, let alone doing a stressful production incident. Give one person the task of updating the business and your customers. Make sure they provide regular updates, and they can prevent interruptions from senior management to the people who are trying to actually fix the problem. If you're like us and you have automated alerts and notifications that come up in your chat channels, then you've seen things like this before. Alert spam makes a channel impossible to use for trying to discuss and solve the issue. So spin up a new channel or a new group, specifically for this one incident. This comes back to communication. If you have multiple people investigating or fixing a problem, you need somewhere that they can all coordinate. And this is especially true if people from multiple teams, areas of the business, or even different companies are involved. It also helps a lot with having an instant timeline for later on, because you can go back and see who was doing what and when. And if you've ever tried to fix something with multiple people, it often ends up like that. Having a central place to talk helps coordination. Make sure that people share what they're doing, changing, investigating, because the last thing that you want is, wait, you were in the middle of restoring the database. I've just pulled the network settings and updated those, and now your database is corrupt. This is a short example of one of our temporary incident channels. And as engineers trying to fix the problem, we are often discussing the issue, sharing logs, graphs, and stats, and announcing any changes or tests or fixes that we're attempting. I've mentioned communicating already, but it is so important. Provide external updates elsewhere every half an hour or 15 minutes or whatever you decide, because there's nothing worse than someone saying, I'm looking into it, and then you hear nothing for an hour, and you wonder, is it fixed? Are they still investigating? Have they gone out for lunch? I don't know. And when you are tired and extremely stressed, you make mistakes. Make sure that your teams and your people take breaks, especially if the problem is long running. It's really hard for people to make themselves take 15 minutes to go and get a coffee, go for a walk, while things are still broken, because they feel obligated to stay until it's fully solved. But if they don't do that, if you don't do that, you'll be less effective, you'll miss obvious things, and you might even make the problem worse. For long-running incidents, this might even involve rotating in shifts, or in larger companies, handing over to other teams across the world, perhaps. Our longest-running incident that I've been part of in the content team was when our EU production cluster started failing due to CPU load, and of course it was 5 p.m. on a Thursday, just as everyone's wanting to go home. We didn't have any increase in traffic, so we spent some time trying to identify the actual cause of the issue with very little success. Given that our US cluster was healthy at the time, we decided to fail all of our traffic to the US, which was great. And then the US started failing as well. So we spend several hours trying to work out what's causing the problem, attempting to get into a state where we can serve anything, any content, and swearing quite a lot. That did happen. And by this point, it's around 10 p.m. The entire team is completely exhausted, and we're struggling to come up with ideas of what we can do. Eventually, it takes our director of engineering to suggest routing our traffic through our staging test environment, manually editing some configuration files to pull the back-end data from our old legacy platform, which we were migrating away from, but fortunately, we hadn't decommissioned yet. It was roughly around midnight before we managed to get to a point where we were serving stable traffic in a very roundabout way. And we all went home and had to continue the investigation the next day. There's no way we could have carried on working at that point in time. Eventually, we had identified the cause as an update to a database query, which made it extremely slow, which then caused an overload on the databases, which then eventually caused the cluster to collapse. But because of the delay, it was very difficult for us to see this. Fortunately, the ft.com front-end team are pretty good, and they failed gracefully in this situation, even though our back-end APIs were extremely unreliable. There was 0 end-user downtime. We did serve some stale content for a few hours, which would have been a problem in a breaking news situation, but fortunately for us, it all worked out. So those are some hopefully useful tips for how to deal with incidents that are in progress. What do you need to do once the dust has settled and you're back online? Take some time for your own mental health, because incidents are very stressful. And if you've been working all day yesterday and through the night, you need to take some time for yourself. Run a meeting to discuss the incident with everyone involved, especially if the incident had a serious impact or had multiple teams or people or businesses. The objective is not to point fingers and assign blame, but it's to discuss what worked, what didn't, and what can we improve for next time. And make sure that you do it soon after the incident, because if you leave it too long, everyone will forget what happened and they'll move on to other work as well. Again, I don't like writing documentation, but incident reports are extremely valuable. This is where keeping a timeline comes in handy. And depending on where you are, the reports that you write might be necessary and very, very formal. You might need to make them public if you have external customers. Or even if you don't, it's worth having them internally for your team and your company so that you have a record of previous incidents that you can refer back to later. So yeah, there's nothing worse than running into a production problem. And your friend says, oh yeah, it's exactly like that time when this happened last year. And then no one can remember what was done to fix it. So make sure you write up what happened and what the solution was. Reports are also really useful for writing talks like this, actually. And at the FT, we find that most of the value comes from identifying follow-up actions. Arguably, they're the most important parts of this whole process. What could have prevented the problem? What could be fixed or improved for next time? And that might be code or infrastructure, but not necessarily. It could be process and procedure as well. Make sure that these actions get done. This is quite a good example of an incident report, I feel. I've never used Travis CI, and I'm not doing this in a negative light. I just liked their report. And what happened was they had an environment variable on a developer's machine that was pointing to the production database. And when they ran some tests, they ran against production, and they dropped the database. That outage, which is bad enough, then turned into a fairly serious security problem, because what happened was user IDs for their customers were reset. And when they logged in, they found that they'd logged in as someone else with access to their personal information and their payment details. And fortunately for them, GDPR wasn't quite in play yet at that time. But as part of their report, they included their follow-up actions. And it has a clear list of things that they are doing or have done that mean the problem shouldn't happen again, or at least reduce the chances of it happening. In this specific case, they removed truncate permissions from their databases, and they added a prompt warning for when people are connected to production. Work out what can be improved for next time, And like I said, this can encompass multiple things. It might be improvements to an instant process, because nobody's plans are perfect, especially when you start out doing this. And you can change them to make them better. Perhaps the call-out or escalation process didn't work very well, and that needs to be improved. Or maybe the documentation was incomplete and needs to be updated. Perhaps there's some obvious bugs or changes to the system that can be fixed up to prevent these issues in the future. So, again, at a different previous company, we had an outage where a business analyst ran some scripts against the production database, thinking that they were connected to pre-production. So, kind of similar to what happened to Travis CI. But the reason that I tell this story is because the production database name was prod, as you might expect, but the pre-production database was named pprod, which is one letter different and very easy to type incorrectly. I didn't name it, but the top of our list of actions was rename that database and don't name databases really similar names in the future. And restrict access to production so that people can't accidentally connect as well. So that's pretty much everything that I wanted to cover today. And I hope that you found it interesting and useful. Just to sum up, incidents and issues are just another part of what we deal with in technology. It's how we plan for them, how we respond to them, and how we improve things afterwards that makes the difference. For those of you that are new to support, I hope I've not completely scared you off. And hopefully you've got some ideas of things that you can go away and do after this with your teams to make your lives easier when something does eventually go wrong. And if you do need to go on call, you'll have some plans in place to cope. So I hope it won't be as terrifying as going in completely blind. Thank you. Clap, clap, clap. So I'm actually working here in Sofia for the next few months. So please do feel free to get in touch and ask me any questions. And I'll be around at the conference as well, possibly at the stall outside. But thank you so much for listening, and I hope you found it interesting. So, bye.
Are you going to answer questions?
Oh, sorry, questions, yes, of course.
We have 10 minutes.
Ah, okay, fair enough.
All right, so we have 10 minutes
hello.
for questions.
Okay, so I've got questions now. So, yes, sorry, I do.
So please raise hands, and I'll throw this at you. Questions, questions, questions. Someone over there at the back, or someone stretching? Someone stretching, all right. So, come on. There's going to be an award for the first person asking a question.
No, there isn't.
Who wants to ask a question? We have 10 minutes. Ivo, do you want to ask a question?
That's a very headlights face if I've ever seen one. So. Oh, no.
Check, check. Oh, it works. Cool.
Hello.
So, are you happy with using Ansible? Because you mentioned that you're using it. Do you still use it? And are you happy with it?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Are you happy with using Ansible?
Ansible. So I do actually quite like Ansible. I think we were possibly using it in the wrong way. My bit about that wasn't really a problem with Ansible. It was a problem with the way that we had written things, just to be really clear. I think I like it more these days for configuration management on servers rather than using it for provisioning infrastructure. And I think Terraform does a better job of that these days. So we're moving away from it, or we're moving it in a different direction. But we still use it. So, yeah.
Great.
All right. So, first question is asked. No award for you. You're an insider. So, more questions. We have time for more questions. Anyone?
Everyone just wants to go to lunch.
Vlatko, do you want to ask a question? You do? All right. You don't?
Oh, I thought
You
I
do?
got away with it.
No? All right.
Yeah.
Alex? You were going to ask. All right.
Okay, hi.
Hello.
So I'm going to ask you a different question. Tell us a little bit more about the office in Sofia, what you want to do here, what you're looking for,
Yeah,
what you're hoping for.
So, as I mentioned, we're opening a new office and we're sort of like looking to hire lots of developers to be in and run empowered teams. So the area that I work in content and some of the other areas at the FT as well, we're moving them over here. So please do get in touch if you're interested. If we're especially Java and Go, We're very interested in people who are Go developers and would like to explore more in that space. Normally I'm quite good at this, and now you put me on the spot. Yeah, come and have a chat with us, and I'll happily tell you more. It'd be great to say hi.
There's a question?
Bum, bum, bum.
How many worse situations that one that you described here have you had? Your hair is not white enough, I think, so that's my question.
So sorry, say that again.
Your hair is not as white as I would expect with the situation you described, so.
Yeah. I think it's, there are definitely some stress wrinkles around my eyes if you see that, but I think one of the important things that I learned early on is what I said before, which is it's probably not as bad as you think, and even if it's broken, what's the actual long-term impact of it? And a lot of the time, it's not as bad as you think it is. It's not ideal, but there's no point getting too wound up about stuff. So at least that's what I try and tell myself and my teams.